One of the things that I would like for you to do as we go through the process is to remember to breathe, especially when we go into the history. And it's important to understand that the racism that we experience today is not anyone's fault. Racism is about conditioning, and it's hundreds of years of conditioning. And when we understand that, we can begin to heal. I always tell people, oh, is it working now?
Not yet.
Okie dokie. Well, you know, it's funny to me because I used to do this work long before we had all this technology. And now it's sort of like, well, you can't do the work without the technology. Like, that's just not going to happen. So the other thing that I want to say is, the other thing that my father said to me when I was still a very young child is, know where you stand, because someday you may have to stand alone. And doing race work for 35 years, I think some of you can imagine that I've been standing alone for a long time. So I am so glad that you showed up. I'm so glad that you showed up. We have a collective history. It's a global history. It's the history of the human family. But for the most part, there are pieces of that history that we haven't learned. And I always remind people that when you go to the hospital, you go to see a doctor because something's going on with you, you're not feeling well, or something's wrong. The first thing they have you do, well, the second thing, the first thing is they ask for the insurance card, okay? But one of the first things they have you do is to write down your history. Why do you think they need that, right? We need that history to understand what came before so that we can understand. Life is a continuum, right? So when we understand what came before, we're able to understand what's happening now. And when we understand what's really happening now, because we're incredibly just amazing beings, right? So we can create a different future for ourselves. When we don't know the history, we just keep repeating patterns without understanding how or why we're repeating those patterns, right? So the history is extremely important. So we're going to go through, if we can get this baby to work.
I can also just sit and click it for you too, because they're not going to be, the remote doesn't want to.
Oh, I can click.
Yeah.
Oh, no
Okay.
problem.
Okay.
Oh, hey, easy. Okay. We know how to do this. There we go. All right. So I was born in the land where the Middle Passage began. A lot of people don't know that, that the Spaniards were enslaving Africans in Quisqueya, also known as La Española, also known as the Dominican Republic, as early as 1509, which is more than 100 years before the Mayflower ever landed in the continental USA. And I tell people that I've experienced racism in 2 languages, at least. And the other thing that I want you to know about me is that I look at race as both an insider and an outsider. Obviously an outsider because I wasn't born in the US. I came to live here when I was 10 years old, came to live in New York City. And also as an insider because as a Black woman, people just assume that I'm African American and I'm actually Afro-Latina. And people don't realize that my first language is Spanish. So I want to introduce you to the people in my life, my parents in the middle, and the young man in the uniform, that was my father when he was a little boy. He went to one of those private schools that a lot of the Native Americans in this country went to. So those schools were all over the world, by the way, and a lot of people don't realize that. My sister, I was her baby because my sister was 30 years older than myself. And the person sitting in the background is my grandmother, and the 2 little ones are a couple of my nieces. And those folks over there are my siblings. My father was born in 1901. My mother was born in 1908. And my mother lived to be close to 99 years old. I am an artist. I think like an artist. I see the world through the eyes of the artist, and these are some of my paintings. I paint a lot of dolphins. But I just I'm going to tell you a little story because I just think it's so important for us to just really ground in the fact that we bring amazing gifts to the planet. And sometimes we don't follow those gifts. So I hadn't painted for a very, very long time. And then I started painting again. And a friend of mine kept telling me, you need to do a one-woman show. So we finally found a gallery. I'm doing a one-woman show. We had hung everything. And everybody had left. And I was just there quietly. And all of a sudden, I stood in the center of the gallery, and I looked around at all these paintings, and I just started crying. Because all I could think about is I could have died with all those colors inside of me. I don't want any of us to die with our colors inside of us. And some of those colors are about how we relate to one another and the love that we actually have for each other. I was trained as a singer because I wanted to be an opera singer at one point. I actually was a carlatura. You can't tell today because my voice is so deep these days. But I ended up using that gift later on in life to be a sound therapist. I'm also a Reiki master and teacher of meditation, teacher of A Course in Miracles. And my work is really based on the Course in Miracles, just so you guys will have a sense of that. I got my calling when I was 13 years old, the day that Dr. King died. I locked myself in the bathroom to cry. It was just my father and I were home. My mother had gone to the store when they announced that he had been killed. And I just got up and quietly went in the bathroom, and I just sobbed and sobbed. And my father kept knocking on the door going, "Are you okay in there?" And I was like, yeah, I'm fine. I was embarrassed. I didn't want my father to know that I was crying. We had been in the country for 3 years. And what hit me in that moment was, oh, they kill people here for being black. And I was 13 years old. So I'm in the bathroom crying, and all of a sudden it's like I heard a voice. I still remember it was right in my right ear. And the voice just said, "You're to continue the work." I don't know where that voice came from. I don't know what it meant. But all I knew was, there's no way I'm ever going to do race work. Excuse me, they just killed somebody for doing that? So, no. So I fought it, resisted it for most of my life. And then there came a time when I couldn't resist it anymore because I was doing diversity work in organizations and I kept talking about race. So I have worked with corporate leaders, with members of Congress, with everyone and anyone who will show up to my seminars to hear and to listen. So what I'm going to share with you today is some of what I've learned. You know that I've written 3 books and I have another book coming up. So what is race literacy? Like, what is that? I had to come up with my own definition because I couldn't find one. And race literacy is the awareness, the knowledge of the history of race, how we are all acculturated into a racial caste system, the impact that that system has on us in mind, body, spirit, and emotions, and how all of that affects us in our everyday lives. Healing is taking what is dysfunctional, wrong, painful, and turning it into something that allows us to be at peace, that takes away the pain, and is functional for all of us. So I wanted us to just kind of have a sense of that, because as we move through the presentation, I want you to remember that there's information that we need if we're going to actually do the healing work that needs to be done around this, right? So we talked about how we need our history and the importance of having some sense of the background and how all of this stuff is linked to today. As far as I'm concerned, we do a lot of anti-racism work these days, which is great. But I really believe that the missing link in this conversation is the word healing. We rarely talk about healing when it comes to race and racism. So to gather our tools for healing, we're going to get some context. We're going to look at how all things are connected. Life is a continuum. Then we're going to create a vision. And then we're going to take action on that vision. Because it's very easy for us to create a vision and then hand it over to somebody else and let them do it, right? But it's about all of us taking our rightful place in the human family. So I'm going to start with context. I'm going to talk about something called axiology. Axiology is the study of values based on culture and environment. So we're going to take a journey, and we're going to travel far, far back when human beings were populating the planet as we know it today, because there were people who were living in various parts of the world, but it looks like the Homo sapiens sapiens were the ones to survive. So let's talk about what happens with people when they live in various parts of the world. So when you live in a northern climate, it's cold. About how long do you have to grow your food? By the way, I like audience participation, so you can just yell out, okay? So about how long do you think you have to, well, you know, right? About how long do you have to grow your food? About 2 to 3 months. Yeah, 2 to 3 months, 5 months at most, right? So if you, okay, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Clothing, food, and shelter. So if you only have about 2 to 3 months to grow your food, what's going to be important to you? How about time? Because if you miss the growing season, you're going to die. How about preservation? Because you need to be able to preserve the grain so that you can eat throughout the season until you can grow some more and harvest, right? What else might be something that you would need or you would be aware of or keeping track of if you're living in a cold climate? So we have preservation, we have time. What are some of the other things that you think you... Shelter, absolutely. And who can build shelter in a cold climate? Yeah, but who? Of those people, who? The men. Because the shelter has to be strong enough against the snow and right? So mostly it was the men who built the shelter in places like that. Let's travel south. Oh, by the way, what else? Clothing, right? You better layer up because you got to keep the body warm. So now all of these cold climate people start traveling down to the warm climates. When you live near the equator, how long do you have to grow your food? 24/7, 365, there's always something growing, right? If the papaya is not growing, the mango's growing. If the mango's not growing, the avocado is growing. There's always something growing. So your view of the world is different from you look out and 9 months out of the year in cold climate, there isn't even a leaf on a tree. I have a friend that has an organization and they're a global organization, but they have an office in DC. And every year they bring people from all over the world and they take them on these various tours to see various parts of the US. And they had this gentleman who lives clearly in a warm climate, and they're taking him around, and it's the end of November. And they took him to Virginia and DC, and then they went up to New York. And about 3 days in, he looks at her and he goes, "You don't have any leaves on your trees. The government needs to do something about that." Because where he comes from, it's lush year-round. There are flowers and fruits on trees, and it's absolutely gorgeous, right? All year round. Their view of the world is different. Do they need clothing? Do they have to wear clothing? No, it's hot, so you don't need to cover your body, right? So how about food? Do they need to preserve that food? They better not, because it's going to go bad, right? Very quickly. And so their perception of the world is different. So northern climate people developed a sense of lack in their awareness. Not good or bad, right or wrong. It is what it is. Because 9 months out of the year, when you look out into your world, there isn't anything growing. There isn't enough. The perception is that there's just not enough. When you go into warmer climate, people are like, there's plenty of everything, including time, right? So So you have a cold climate person go down to the Caribbean, and they're wearing all these layers, right? And they're wondering why those people are naked. And then when it comes to looking at food, they're like, oh my gosh, look at all this food, right? And they try to preserve it, but it goes bad, because that's not what you do in those climates. Axiology works really well in its own climate. It's when we start to impose that axiology on other people that we get into trouble. Because it's kind of like preserving the food and it goes bad, right? Like having an awareness of your axial pattern is really important because you value things differently. So the axiology for northern climate people is actually humans or man's, because this axiology thing was based on male, right? And so it's man's relationship to man's relationship to the object. Because remember that the object is what helped you survive. So it's man's relationship to the object. For people around the equator, it's man's relationship to man. It's all about relating to people because you had all this time to relate to one another. You didn't have to grow any food, and you look at the world differently. And so you have people from cold climates go down to warm climate and go, I ordered my food 45 minutes ago. What's going on? Where's my food? And the waiter will look at you and go, take it easy, Mom, plenty of time. Right? Because their perception of time is different. And their perception of the world is that there's always plenty. Because when they look out into the world, there is always plenty. Everything's lush. Okay? So I want you to keep axiology. And I'm just giving you little bits of axiology so you'll have a sense of where we're going next. So the axial pattern for natives is man's relationship to the Great Spirit. Everything is related to the Great Spirit, and they saw themselves as keepers of the land, not owners of the land. Okay, because there's a different way of looking at things. So, and for Asian is man's relationship to the group. Okay? All right. More context. Understanding trauma is extremely important, and we're going to travel back to Europe in the 1400s, and let's talk a little bit about what was happening in Europe during the 1400s. So, punishment had been institutionalized for a very long time, goes back to the Roman era and so on and so forth, right? But what we know about trauma today helps us to really understand what was happening to people. So people in Europe would travel for miles to see one beheading or to see what we call a lynching, right? And sometimes with 5 or 6 different people would be hung at the same time. They were always public spectacles. They were public spectacles because they were meant to traumatize. And it was traumatized to destabilize, because remember, when people are traumatized, they're destabilized. So it's trauma to destabilize to control, because there would be maybe 40, 50 people in a monarchy, in the family of the monarch, versus thousands of people that they had to rule, right? And so the quickest way to control human beings is to frighten them. The quickest way to frighten them is through violence. So how they did this stuff was always out in public so everyone would see it, because you don't have to traumatize the whole village. You only need to work on one person at a time and get everybody else to watch. So there is individual trauma, the person who's actually being punished, and then there's the collective trauma, which is secondary trauma, excuse me, which comes from seeing the violence, hearing about the violence, reading about the violence, learning about the violence, hearing the stories, and so on and so forth. Okay, does that make sense? And so people would travel for miles to see one of these spectacles, and they didn't exactly leave the kids home with the babysitter. If they didn't want to come out of their houses to watch this, the soldiers would go in and get them and make sure that they came out to watch it. And if they didn't do then they would parade somebody's head around town and so on, because all of that was meant to traumatize, to destabilize, to control. Okay? Here's what we know today. We know that traumatized people traumatize others, unless they've had some healing, right? And we also know that people tend to traumatize pretty much the same way that they were traumatized. But we know even more than that now. We also know that trauma gets passed on. And it gets, well, actually, it's not that we know it now. We've known this for a long time. You know that little book they call the Bible with all those books from that different people wrote? There's a little something in there that says, the sins of the father shall be visited upon the son 7 generations hence, or something like that, right? If you substitute the word, because remember, meanings of words have changed over time. If you substitute the word sin for trauma, it changes the entire meaning of that. The trauma of the father shall be visited on the children. So what we know now is that trauma gets passed on epigenetically, and it gets passed on from one generation to the other, and it gets passed on for many generations. And the thing to remember is that I think sometimes people look they sort of have this differential between victim and perpetrator. But the reality is that the perpetrator is also traumatized. And then that trauma gets passed on to their children and their children and their children. And we don't ever look at that or consider that. So now you have, everybody's traumatized, right? And the papacy and the monarchies were always at odds with each other, trying to decide who actually had the God-given right to rule. So they made a lot of decisions for people that people had. They weren't voting, okay? And so the decisions were made for them. So as we look at trauma, it's important to remember that trauma is something that has existed in all people throughout, because if you don't have violence and things like that, then there are also natural disasters and those kinds of things. So there are different ways that people get traumatized. But I want to tell you a little story before I show you this very short video. I think it's like a minute and a half. And that is that not too long ago, a group of scientists did some work with mice and cherry blossom oil. And what they were doing is they're pumping this fragrance of cherry blossom oil into these cages with mice. And every time they pumped in the oil, they would electrocute the mice. Now, remember Pavlov's dogs, right? Like after a while, they sound. So the mice now, as soon as they would smell the cherry blossom oil, they didn't have to electrocute them anymore. They would go into, post-traumatic stress, right? So the mice are traumatized. They found that the next generation of mice acted more traumatized than the first generation when they smell the cherry blossom oil. Now, I have a theory about that. My theory is, that first generation after the trauma didn't have context. They were just acting out of what was happening in their bodies when they would smell the cherry blossom oil. They found that there were epigenetic changes in the brains of the mice up to 6 generations. If you add the first generation, you have your 7th generation. Remember that little saying? The sins of the father shall be visited 7 generations hence. Yeah, we've known for a long time that if you traumatize one person in a family, one person in a village, everybody gets traumatized. And then there's the reality that there's this wonderful experiment that Greg Braden talks about in one of his books, I believe it's Awakening to Zero Point, where he talks about the military had done this experiment they had a donor and they swabbed him, took the DNA, put it in a little tube. They wired the tube to one of those machines, kind of like a lie detector type of thing. And they also wired the donor. And they then showed the donor a bunch of different films to get a reaction, erotic films and sad films and war films and blah, blah, blah. And every time that the donor would react, the DNA would react exactly the same way. They got exactly, and there was no time lag. So they thought, oh, it has to be because they're in the same room. So they took the DNA, they put it in another room, they repeated the same experiment, got the same exact results. So it was like, oh, it's got to be close proximity. So then they took the DNA and they put it in another building. Then they moved it a mile away. They stopped the experiment at 50 miles because what they realized was that it didn't matter where they put that DNA. It was going to have the same exact reaction as the donor at exactly the same time. We are all connected through our DNA. We are one human family. So what we think and feel about others can be felt by them even when they're not conscious of it. I mean, and so that's on the negative side. On the positive side is what we think and feel about others can make a difference, right? It can make a difference. So I want to share this film with you because when we first started to look at trauma, we were looking at survivors of war, particularly soldiers. But now we've expanded that definition to, psychological and emotional and so on.
We already know that this is a gene that contributes to risk for depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. When we looked at their own children also had an epigenetic change in the same spot on a stress-related gene.
Okay, so I want you to hold that. So now you're holding the information on axiology. I'm sorry, let me just see if we can move. Here we go. The information on axiology, you have a little bit of trauma. It's important to be trauma informed if we're going to be doing any kind of healing work around race. So now let's look at this little thing, which is a formula that worked and got repeated. So let's go back to the northern climate and let's talk about growing seeds and and being able to have food till the next season. So let's say that I live in this village, and the folks in this village have done their best to grow food, but they don't have enough. They weren't able to harvest enough to help them through to the following season. And they know that the people in the other village bumper crop. They have more than enough to feed themselves and all the people in their village, and even have a little extra to share. So I'm going to pick on you, Janelle. So I now have I have this idea that I should go to Janelle's village because they grew the bumper crop and talk to them about sharing some of that food with us. So I go over there and I speak with her, and she said, "I'm so sorry, I can't share the grain with you because we want to make sure that our people survive till the next season." Makes sense, right? So we're concerned that there's not going to be enough to be able to share. So I go back to my village and I tell the folks at my village, she's got plenty of grain, but she's not going to share it with us. But I tell you what, I know I can get that grain. I'm the biggest, baddest guy in the village, right? People trust me, and I can go get that grain. But in order for me to get that grain, I'm going to need each one of you to let me have your firstborn to go with me so that we can ensure we get the grain. People in the village go, "Oh, I don't know," but they say yes. And by the way, when I get back with the grain, because you know I will, what I need from you is 5% of the grain that you get. You have to give me 5% for having gone to get the grain for you. So I go and I literally burn the village, right? Grab the grain, enslave the people who are left, because now those people know how to grow grain, right? And we could use them. So we keep some of them, whoever survived, bring them back to the village with all of their possessions and everything that they have. And so now I come back Everybody's firstborn. Yeah, we might have lost one or two, but for the most part, I got most of them back. And everybody gives me 5% of their grain. So what do I have now? I have wealth and I have an army. You can't mess with me now, right? And the villagers will probably do everything I tell them to do, especially if I threaten them with my wealth and my army, right? So we create this little formula that's great because now we know that we can get whatever we want with this formula, the army and the resources, right? So we do this in various parts of the country, and we always come back with the grain, and people celebrate that we're back with the grain. And some people aren't happy because they lose some of their loved ones getting the grain, but we know how to do this. The grain is the object, right? The grain is the object. So remember the papacy and the monarchy who are at odds with one another? They come up with this great idea. Actually, the papacy comes up with this great idea. And in the early 1430s or so, Prince Henry the Navigator, as he's called, although he never sailed or anything else, it's just that, he invested in other people sailing and going to various parts of the world to conquer. They come up with this wonderful idea, something called a papal bull. And the papal bull gave the blessing to the Prince of Portugal to sail and conquer the coast of Africa, the west coast of Africa. And here is how this papal bull read. Now, I need to tell you that the papal bull, and I really want you to breathe, especially as we read this papal bull, because this papal bull is actually what created what we are experiencing today. So, it actually gave the right to the prince to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ wheresoever placed, and the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever held and possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. They were also to appropriate for themselves and their descendants, successors, and heirs the kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods, and to convert them to his own profit and the profit of his children. Remember, descendants, successors, and heirs. Now, this is called a papal bull, and it's called that because when the papacy would write these things on parchment, they would seal it with wax, and then they would stamp it, and they would put a little, it was like a little ribbon that held this ball, that's what's called a bull. So that's why it's called a papal bull. So that was in the 1430s. It was revised in the 1450s, and then Fernando and Isabella were given the opportunity to send Columbus, because remember he went to the Italian crown. He was trying to find a place. He was trying to find a new route to India, and he went to the Italian crown, and they said no, and he went to the Spanish crown, and they said yes. And so Columbus now sails with the permission, I'm going to put that back up, with the permission and the blessing of the papacy, who were trying to convert people all over the world to Catholicism. It wasn't just Christianity, it was Catholicism, very specifically, and which meant that everyone who was not Catholic was in danger. The Hindus, the Jews, the Muslims. And as the Europeans traveled and began to colonize and conquer, this is what gave them the right to go ahead and conquer the world and to turn those whom they have conquered into perpetual slaves. So, um, so here we are, and it's 1493, and Columbus has now Quisqueya, which he claimed for the Spanish crown and called La Española, which is now also known as the Dominican Republic. And he also sailed to Cuba. And when he went back to Spain, he took Taínos with him. The Taínos were the natives that were on that island. He took some Taínos with him because he wanted to prove that he had found India. And they had dark skin and straight jet black hair. And so he brought some of them with him, along with gold, silver, and some food. So remember that the monarchies were all related, right? So word spread like wildfire. And they brought back the doctrine of discovery, which is this papal bull. And since 1493, we collectively, as a human family, have been living under the doctrine of discovery. And if you think that that happened yesterday, and it has nothing to do with today, the last time that the U.S. used the doctrine of discovery was in 2005, when Justice Ginsburg used it to win a case against the United Tribes in New York. It's been used by Canada, Australia. All of the places that were once colonized are all under the sovereignty of the doctrine of discovery from 1493. Why is it we can't heal racism? Because we don't even know where it came from. And if we're going to heal, I want you to please breathe. If we're going to heal, we need to understand our history. So, this is international law. We are a country of laws. Now, let's be fair here. Laws do not always equate to justice, right? Because this is law. This is law. And as long as this exists, any lawyer, just like the Supreme Court has used it, by the way, it's been cited in over 5,000 cases. The land grab of the 1830s goes back to this, the doctrine of discovery. So as long as that exists, any lawyer at any given point in time can just go, it's in the book. So it's important for us to be aware and conscious of what it is that we're really talking about and what it is that we're really dealing with when it comes to racism. Las castas. So I want you to hold that. So now you're holding several different things, right? Las castas, which is the Spanish caste system, is the system of racism that we are under. And that was established early on. Because remember that in Europe, the person who could inherit was the firstborn male, right? Women could not inherit. In fact, women were part of the chattel. Women were part of what they were objects. They became objectified. Because remember the whole thing around the human's relationship to the object? After a while, you say, this object thing really works. So you begin to objectify everything, people, places, and things. And when we do that, we dehumanize each other, right? We dehumanize. So, Las Castas is a caste system. And they established it early because they were tracking who could inherit. Who could inherit was the firstborn male. So now you have these, the Europeans who are now mating with, sometimes raping, sometimes consensual sex, and having children with the African women and the native women. And sometimes their firstborn male child was with one of these women. So they wanted to make sure that people knew real quick that those children could not inherit. And so one of the first things they did was they established marriage. Because remember, racism is institutional, systemic, internalized, and interpersonal. So they institutionalized marriage the way that marriage is institutionalized in Europe. but they were very specific about the way that they institutionalized marriage. The only legal marriage was between two Europeans, which automatically made everybody else's union illegal, which meant that the children from those unions were illegitimate. And they used to be called that. But if you institutionalize marriage so that only certain people can get married, then that means that everybody else is illegal. When you are illegal, and I'm using that term very specifically, when you are deemed illegal, you have no rights. So those children had no rights. And they were very specific even about the way that they named the children of those unions. So you have at the very top on the left, you have two Europeans who were allowed to marry. And they did it pictorially because it was illegal for women, colonized and enslaved people to learn to read and write unless they needed you to for purposes of helping to run the business or the household and stuff like that. So it was illegal for you to learn to read and write. So they made a pictorial so anyone could look at this. And the children had different names. They would call children wolves. One of the descriptions of those children was, yo no sé lo que tú eres, which means, I don't know what you are, because they were came from blended families. One of the terms that they used to name those children was mulatto. How many of you, by a show of hands, have heard of the word mulatto? Mulatto comes from the word mule. What is it that mules cannot do? They cannot reproduce. The message to the men was, if you mate and have a child with one of those women, that's the end of your lineage. So, marriage laws, and we're going to talk now about the U.S. specifically. There were marriage laws in the books. Those marriage laws that you could not marry outside of your race were in the books all the way through until 1967. Some of you saw a movie called The Lovings, and it was about a family in Virginia, a white male and a black female that had married, and their marriage wasn't legal, which meant that their children were what? Illegitimate. And so they had to fight in court, and finally the Supreme Court decided that blended marriages were legal. So we're talking how many hundreds of years that those marriages were illegal? And so one's right to choose one's partner has been now taken away because we're one human family and people fall in love with people just because of who they are. But now we have laws that say, but you can't marry them, and if you marry them, your children are not going to be allowed human rights. So we have the caste system. The caste system is very interesting because everybody absorbed the caste system differently, depending on where you fell within the caste. So how white people internalized the caste system was as supremacy. And supremacy isn't just something that we talk about when we're talking about the KKK and neo-Nazis. Supremacy actually comes from, it's from the word superior, which had to do with the rights of kings, okay? And who was superior to rule over, okay? So that's where that comes from. The way that brown people internalized the caste system was through colonization. African people internalized the caste system through colonization and enslavement. But now everybody's sick. And there are levels of oppression. And I think that we don't always consider, we place such a high value on the object, right? That we don't always consider the ways in which white people are also oppressed. Because it's hidden behind privilege. And privilege is not just about who is wealthy and who isn't. When we're talking about racial privilege, what we're actually talking about is access, opportunity, immunity, innocence, and freedom, which other folks don't get to have because they're under some very specific rules that they don't even know about. John Bradshaw, in his book, Family Secrets, talks about how in families, people have secrets. And it isn't because, in some families, they're trying to keep the secret, right? But some families, it isn't necessarily that they're trying to keep something secret. It's that nobody talks about stuff. And if nobody talks about stuff, what happens is that our brain fills in the blanks with what we do know. So we start imagining all kinds of things, right? When we don't know the history, we live out of family secrets, and we fill in the blanks with stuff that may or may not be truth. But if we're going to heal, we need that stuff. So I need for you to breathe. Just keep breathing. Just really just fill up your belly and just breathe, because this is part of our collective history. So how does all of that impact us today? It impacts us in our actions, reactions, and interactions. As I mentioned before, racism is institutional, systemic, internalized, and interpersonal. It actually becomes very personal. And some of you in your organizations, you may have done bias work, right? How many of you have heard of bias work in organizations? Yeah, pretty common. The thing about bias work is this, the upshot of it is we all have biases, and yes, we do. They help us survive as a human species, right? But racial biases are very specific, and they're conditioned. And by the time children are 3 years old, they know the caste that they belong to. They know who is considered good and who is considered bad in the society. And they will tell you that. And they've run tests from 1954 till today, getting the same exact results from children regardless of the color of their skin. They're called the doll tests. And you can, I love this, because when I first started to do this work, people had to, run to the library to say, that can't be true, Now they sit on their phone and they fact check me. So times have changed. So racism is about conditioning. And it's about hundreds of years of conditioning. And if we don't understand what the conditioning is, and all we're looking at is the condition, which, by the way, we don't even consider it a condition, right? I mean, we're starting to now, because a lot of counties and states are declaring racism a public health crisis. I can't tell you how glad I was to finally see that, because now we can start treating it as a condition. Does that make sense? So, what does it take for us to heal? So for us to heal, we need to become race literate. We need to become racially conscious, which means that being aware of our own triggers, being aware of the way we act, react, and interact with people, the things that we say, asking questions. Healing takes courage. It really does. The thing is that we are incredibly courageous. And the other thing about us is that, how amazing we are as human beings. We are incredible learners. We were just badly taught. The good news and the bad news is that we learned all this stuff. So that's the good news and the bad news, because anything that was learned can be unlearned and replaced with something new. But we need to know what it is we're dealing with. Once we know, even if we choose to remain the same, at least we won't be doing it out of ignorance. We'll be making a conscious choice. When our choices get taken away, what gets taken away from us is something that is vital to our survival, our right to choose. We are extraordinary, and we can change anything. Now, a lot of people say, as a white person, you need to go back into your community and work with your own people. And that's true. But if you don't know what you're dealing with, how are you going to do that? My belief is you don't heal segregation with more segregation. We heal it by coming together as a community, acknowledging what we have learned, how we have been conditioned, and then working collectively together to make a different world, to leave behind a different world for the next generations. And we can do that. We can work as one human family. We are here, I mean, we're wired for bliss, right? And this stuff is taking away some of that. We spend so much time on this stuff. And now we need to, because now we're becoming conscious and we need to heal. And we know that, right? That's very different from just floundering around in a circle with the same stuff over and over and over again, which is what we tend to do when we don't know our history, when we don't know why we're acting, reacting, and interacting with each other the way that we are, when we don't understand where our biases came from. They're conditioned. They're conditioned. And the trauma that we have all experienced throughout time. And if trauma gets passed on and we don't say, okay, the buck stops here, what happens is another generation gets to carry it. I don't want my children to carry this anymore. At some point, I hope to have grandchildren. You hear me, Joseph? Anyway, and I don't want those children to have to work as hard as I have. I want them to know that they belong, that they're part of an extraordinary family, that there are cousins over there that sometimes we don't even want to talk to them, but they're still our cousins, right? They're still our family. We are here to love, to learn from one another, to enjoy each other's company. I mean, the reason that we are created the way that we were created is so that no human being would be an island unto themselves. We are here to explore life together. And how extraordinary it is that we have been given the ability and the right to do that. The other thing I want to say is, you know, we can get really ticked off of those folks over there, okay? And that's really easy to do. And it's important that you do that. Whatever your emotions are, whatever you're holding at this point in time is exactly how you're supposed to feel. There's no good or bad, right or wrong. If you're angry, if you're confused, whatever it is, you have a right to that. No one has a right to tell you how to feel or to take away your right to choose. So we can get very angry and stay there, but here's what I'm going to say about anger. Anger is a place we visit, but you don't want to live there. You don't want to live there. So I want us to do a little exercise. Where are we with time? It's...
We're ready for questions and answers whenever you.
Ooh, okay. But just one more thing. Okay. So I want us to do a little exercise because I need for you to understand how much of this stuff we've absorbed. So I want you to take a nice deep breath. If you're holding anything, put it down and put your feet flat on the ground. Take a nice deep breath. Blow it out. And I want you to just close your eyes and relax for a minute. I want you to bring your awareness inside of your body. Notice how your heart is beating. Notice the flow of energy in your body. And what I want you to do is silently to yourself, just simply say to yourself the word racism. Racism. And notice your body. Racism. Take a nice deep breath, blow it out, and now say to yourself silently again, peace. 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 Nice deep breath, blow it out, open your eyes, and what I'd like to know is, by a show of hands, how many of you could feel the difference between peace and racism? Yay, I knew you guys would. What I would like to know is where you felt it. Those of you who could feel the difference between those two, where did you feel racism and where did you feel peace? So I'd like to have 2 or 3 of you to share with us what you felt and where you felt it. Please.
The racism was in my throat. It wouldn't allow me to speak.
Yeah.
And I started to cry.
Yeah.
But I I always cry in big groups anyway, so.
Okay.
And then the peace was, it kind of took that and it allowed the passage, and I felt it in my heart, and my second chakra.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, who else felt the difference? Yes, please.
It was in my gut.
Mm-hmm.
Just almost like,
It was in your gut, yeah? And it felt like it wasn't moving? Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much.
yeah, almost like nauseousness just right away. And then I think peace was just a flow of energy that just was a flow. This works. It just flows.
Yeah, thank you. One more, please. Yes.
Weirdly, I felt it from my hips to my knees. My legs were tight and this was rigid. And then the same feeling with peace. The same feeling with peace, that part of my body relaxed. Bizarre.
Yeah,
Not
thank
about that.
Okay, so the reason I have you do that exercise is for a few different reasons, but one of them is for you to, one, realize how quickly you can change your state of consciousness. Please remember that your body makes a chemistry for everything, every blink of an eye, every thought you think, every bit of anger that you feel, and every sense of peace and joy that you feel. Your body makes a chemistry for all of it, right? And then the other thing that is important with that exercise is that where you certainly the racism piece, it's probably where your biological tribe gets sick. So if you felt it in some people feel it in their head. So if you felt it in your head, you probably have a family history of eye problems, migraine headaches, just vision problems and things like that. If you felt it in your gut, you probably have a family history of digestive problems, bowel problems, and things like that. If you felt it in your throat, you probably have a family history of obviously sore throat and nasal problems and things like that, but also speaking up. Speaking up. So, knowing that can be helpful, because what happens is when people want to talk about race, their stress response gets triggered. It's fight, flight, or paralysis. And your body makes a chemistry for all of it. So I'm going to stop here, and I want to thank you all so much for being here and for caring about this important topic. I think we're at a crossroads where we can really go all the way and really begin to heal within ourselves and our families and our communities. So thank you for being here. And